Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to episode 36 of the ESG Show. And today we're talking about navigating the ESG backlash. Now, ESG isn't anti-profit. It isn't even profit maximization, but maybe we could add a suffix to that. It isn't profit maximization in the long term, but I guess it's not quite so supportive of short-termism. At least that's my view. Maybe this morning's guests or today's guests can correct me or agree with me on that point. But maybe that issue about short-term versus long-term is the problem, and maybe it's a misunderstanding. US TV host Tucker Carlson calls ESG a destructive force, pressurizing governments to sabotage their own economies. And there are those who hate ESG. There are those who don't have a problem with the concept behind it, but they think it is used as a kind of smokescreen. They think they can wash bad behaviour with green colours without any attempt to change their behaviour. People who work in ESG, even its greatest advocates, have sympathy with the greenwashing charge. Companies that talk the ESG talk without action to back it up are a huge problem. But Carlson says ESG conflicts with the fiduciary duty of companies. Is he right? ESG advocates say it is an opportunity that ESG can support recruitment and staff retention in an age of labour shortages. Others see an analogy between the principles of disruptive technology and ESG. They talk about the need for resilience, supply chain, the opportunities with net zero, and how companies that are late to the ESG party might never catch up. Anyway, before we meet today's guests, let me tell you about an important project the ESG Show is involved with. Later this month, we're going to be exploring the intersection of ESG and cybersecurity in some depth. Next week, we're doing a show on the topic, and on May the 23rd, we are collaborating with the organisers of an in-person event, ESG through a cyber lens. The event is on May the 23rd. It's being held in Plymouth, but you can also watch it online here. And by the way, for good or bad, I'm going to be hosting a few other sessions there. ESG through a cyber lens is the first of its kind event that seeks to understand the deep-rooted connections between ESG and an organization's cyber posture, its company culture around cybersecurity. With digital so integral to achieving almost all ESG goals, it's critical to understand how these things connect. And as it happens, the UK government is in the final phases of consultation around a new directive for cyber governance, which will make it even more clear that company directors are responsible for their cyber posture as much as their fiduciary duties. And the UK government's lead for this new code of practice will be one of the keynote speakers at the event. And the event is split into 3 sessions. And what I thought I would do is show you what those 3 sessions are. The first event, ESG through a cyber lens, the fundamental connection between cyber and ESG. And you can click on the link to that event on LinkedIn. The second session is let's dive into cyber governance. And the third session is practical steps to achieve ESG through a cyber lens. So that's that event. I think it's time we moved on and met today's guests. And today with us on the show is Alison Taylor. Hello, Alison. How are you today?
I'm very well, thanks. How are you?
Yes, I'm excellent, thank you. And where are you dialing in from today?
I'm in Woodstock, New York, which is about 2 hours north of New York City.
Okay, excellent. So Alison Taylor is a clinical associate professor at NYU, executive director at Ethical Systems, and author of Higher Ground. She has spent decades advising businesses on issues at the intersection of risk and responsibility. And Alison, I believe you're also the author of a book called Higher Ground. Can you tell us a little bit about the book?
Sure. The book premise is that in the 2020s, we have completely lost sight of what it means to be a good or ethical business, to the degree we don't even have a common term or word we can use to explore the ideas and explore the debate. And the controversy about the acronym ESG is one of the expressions of this, but it is not the only expression. And I try to lay out what I believe being a good business does mean today, and to cut through the jargon and to cut through some of these debates, and to lay out a path forward that is achievable and practical for executives, because I think there is a lack of practical advice in this domain as well.
Okay, thank you for that. Now, you wrote an article recently. I'm going to call the article up, actually. At least I'd like to call it up, but here it is. In Harvard Business Review, I think. Corporate advocacy in a time of social outrage. And in that article, you wrote, employees, particularly young ones, want employers to provide much more than a paycheck. Why do you think that?
Do you disagree?
I don't disagree, no, but I'm interested. We had a guest on last week saying something similar, but I'm interested to know what you think, why you think that is, and if you could just expand on that comment for a few seconds.
Sure. So, I mean, I think the first thing to say is that young people grew up in the aftermath of the global financial crisis. They have grown up seeing the evidence of climate change and reading news reporting about that. They have grown up in an atmosphere where social media means there is far more transparency about corporate behavior and the way that corporations are taught and arguably encouraged, right, to dump their negative externalities onto society. And there are, very many reasons why, if you can do that and if you can get away with that, that is perceived to be good for profit maximization. So there is enormous public concern about that, and young people have grown up surrounded by that. I think all of this has meant there are fairly profound value shifts in terms of how they think about work and how they think about the role of corporations in society. And then maybe the most under-discussed and arguably most important thing is that globally we have lost faith in governments to solve these problems. So there has been a pivot over the last decade to suggesting that corporations are the only entities in society with the scale and reach to solve a problem like climate change and inequality. And so I also think that you see from young people a lot of energy and maybe aspirations you would have previously put on the political process and now being put on companies. So there are many, many, many examples, almost too many to mention, but certainly in the US, this has all coincided with a rise in willingness of corporate leaders to speak up on controversial topics.
Okay, I think that's a really good point you made there about how there's this distrust of government, so they want the corporate world to I think that's really well put, and I don't think I've heard it worded quite like that before. So I thought that was a really good point. You also in your article you stated the desire to balance stakeholder interests and speak up for employees on higher stakes societal questions is colliding with the realities of divided, polarized workforces, political dysfunction, and anger about corporate hypocrisy. These issues are particularly fraught in the United States in a charged presidential election year, though they resonate far more widely. And increasingly, companies are facing backlash around what they are or not saying on issues such as ESG and DEI, with many hesitating to defend their choices and sparking further employee frustration in the process. So what do you think, any thought, and this is a big question, but what do you think lies behind this polarization? Any thoughts on that one?
Oh, well, I mean, it's a big topic. You can make structural arguments about the election process in the US, about the primary process, which encourages extreme candidates. We can think about, even stuff like members of Congress not interacting in Washington, D.C. in the way that they used to. We can think about this also in terms of there has been a very big rise in what is called affective polarization, so affective with an A, meaning that it is no longer the case that we might disagree with someone politically but still like them as a neighbor. We're now increasingly likely to say that the people we disagree with are evil and stupid and we should not speak to them and they're kind of beyond redemption. So there is a level, I think, of dysfunction and viciousness about the conversation, and it really feels that the neutral middle ground doesn't exist anymore, and that we're really in two camps of people yelling at each other. And I think a lot of people feel very alienated about this situation, but it's becoming very difficult, I think, for corporate leaders to chart a path through this.
Yeah, okay. All right, thanks for that, Alison. So, Alison, can you join us again in a few minutes? I'm just going to introduce Paul and then bring you back on again. Hello, Paul. And where in the world are you today?
Hi, Michael. How are you doing? I'm at the Abu Dhabi Investment Management Congress in Abu Dhabi. So, yeah, calling in from there.
Okay. And so we've got sort of half the globe covered today then. You're in the Middle East, you've got Alison in New York and me in the UK. I think we've got half the globe there. Half the globe in three guests.
Yesterday I was in Baku, Azerbaijan, which, as you know, is hosting COP29. So it's been a runaround week in the climate context.
Okay. Right. So Paul is the founder of the Blended Capital Group, and he's also the special advisor, Mishcon Impact, Mishcon Dareya LLP. In 2004, he coined ESG, and in 2006, he delivered the UN Principles of Responsible Investment. So, Paul, who is Blended Capital Group?
Blended Capital Group is something I started in 2012 when I left the UN, where I've been the head of UNEP Finance Initiative for 12 years. And Blended Capital is a combination of advisory, working on some of the gnarliest sustainability problems for large corporations down different value chains. But my real passion is our focus on supporting and working with and providing equity for companies that provide sustainability solutions for last mile communities, whether that's farmers in Africa or miners in the Amazon. We look to conflate AI, machine learning, digital, mobile banking, and with a range of tech, whether it's solar tech or agri-tech. That's what we like to do. So it's that combination. If I was to simplify it, it's to mobilize finance at scale into sustainability solutions, both within capital markets, but also in the last mile, or the first mile, as some people prefer to call it.
Indeed. So you say you coined ESG in 2004. What do you mean by you coined ESG? And can you give us a background there?
Yeah, sure. Look, I was a UN official, ran something called UNEP-FI, which was a partnership between the UN, rather unusual, with banks, insurers, asset managers, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds. Brilliant team, brilliant young team. From 2002 onwards, we worked. And ESG actually morphed from OHSE, which is Occupational Health, Safety and Environment. I won't go into all the details, but in terms of coining ESG, there was one morning in my office in May 2004 in which 5 of us, James Gifford, Philip Walker, Gordon Haggett, and Trevor Bowden, Jacob Malthouse, so there were 6, we had to come up with what the term was. It should have been GES, governance, environmental and social. Without governance, you don't fix anything else. And to be honest, my role, I had a really bright team around me who worked very hard, was to manipulate their acronym. Environment sexy, governance can anchor everything at the end. The thing that gets kicked off the end by Milton Friedman-esque sort of lobbyists is S, social, so fuse it in the middle. That's ESG. Now, lots of people will claim to have had some involvement in it. That was the meeting, May of 2004. And as I said, it had morphed from occupational health, safety, and environment. And so look, as a personal footnote, my 2 young boys went to the Geneva English School, the acronym for which was GES, and therefore it couldn't be GES. I half joke, but these personal factors do come into play. But yeah, UN official, brilliant team, had worked very hard, not just on the legal aspects of ESG, the sell-side research, which we secured 1,100 pages for from 2002 onwards, and it was built to actually support the UN Principles for Responsible Investment, which were launched 2 years later by Kofi Annan.
Okay, so the acronym ESG was born in that meeting.
Yeah.
And out of interest,
and
do you think
it was a good old scrap? It should have been SG, it could have been GS, but it was ESG in the end. Easy ESG as easy as 1, 2, 3 ABC. We had no idea where it would end up. It was meant to be a signal to show to asset owners that environmental, social, governance risks were systemic, were going to impact value, and that these risks wouldn't go away. So it was meant to be based in the language of materiality and fiduciary duty, not CSR, not ethics. Nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with socially responsible investment. But the whole argument was geared around what's material and where does it affect your fiduciary duty. And it was for asset owners, pension funds, insurance reserves, sovereign wealth funds. That was the original focus.
I think it's easy to forget that it started off as a thing for investors. Yeah, okay. And you also delivered the UN Principles of Responsible Investment. That was in 2006.
Yeah, look, the late and great Secretary General, and he truly was late and great, Kofi Annan, on April the 27th, 2006, had a $1 trillion of assets on that iconic New York Stock Exchange platform. As the head of the multilateral system, he opened the American markets that day. And again, it was a signal. We had CalSTRS, British Telecom, we had the Thai government pension fund, we had Munich Re, we had insurance reserves on the balcony with the Secretary General. The signal was that the long-term goals of the United Nations, which are essentially security, development, humanitarian issues, and peace, were aligned with the needs and wants of long-term asset owners. That was the signal. On that day, we had $1 trillion on the platform and 53 members. Now it's over 5,500 and $121 trillion, a staff of 140 in London. So look, memorable day for me, and there was 3 years of really hard work behind it for my team. So that was the root of it. We never thought that it would morph in the way that it has.
Okay, I think I'd like to bring Alison in at this point. Hello, Alison. Welcome back. So, out of interest, on the topic of ESG, do you think that acronym is here to stay? Because there are people that think, oh, Paul's gone. Oh, you're back. There are people that think that the name will change. Some people talk about people, planet, profits, and impact. And do you have any thoughts about that? Do you think the acronym is here to stay?
I don't know. I mean, there has been this backlash. There is a conversation going on right now that if we just coin a new term, somehow the controversy will disappear. I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think the term is the issue. I think the issue is that we're having a very high stakes debate about the role of business in society and the role of investment capital to drive the change that we need to see, which is inherently political and inherently controversial. So there are people arguing that you'll have more differentiated strategies focusing on one or other of the letters. There are other people that also point out rightly that there are connections between these issues. And I think Paul has just articulated that very well. So what I think we will see is increasing investor sophistication and a variety of approaches in terms of driving various of these outcomes, whether you want to have them more broadly or more narrowly. And I think we'll continue to see the debate evolve and mature. But I guess I think the debate about whether the term is here to stay is a bit of a red herring.
Yeah.
Okay. Paul, anything to add to that?
Yeah, no, look, the acronym doesn't matter. The reality of it in the world we're in, the systemic strategic and operational risks don't disappear. I love the way Alison focused on, someone who's grown up during I quite often use the idea, if you're born in 2000, by the time it was 2021, you've lived through and either been affected badly by or not at all by the global financial crash. You've got climate change and ecosystems destruction behind that. You've got, COVID is not the last novel zoonotic virus we will see. That's clear. And that are issues around, a growing population of mankind and nature. You then have a number of wars, including a major European. So by the time you're 21, why should you trust government? Why should you trust institutions? Why should you trust many of those basic building blocks that, people should trust? So I come back to that. The acronym doesn't matter. Acronyms come and go. But what the worst parts in some ways of business or the capital markets, they ignore the reality of the mid to long-term systemic risks. That swallows and eats values. That's what we have to focus on. So, when I see 5 Republican senators, I think it was the beginning of last year, writing to the top 50 US law firms, warning them not to get involved in climate cartels or ESG scams. Look, to me, the alarm bells ring. That when politicians tell the market what risks to assess and what not to assess, right. I think that used to be called central planning. And the fact that you've got Rubio doing the same in a letter, we don't want that. We don't want politicians telling the market. We want them to regulate, provide a policy framework, but not dictate what risks they don't or do look at. So again, coming back to the acronym, ESG, SGE, G, I'm very, very relaxed about it. We have to focus on the issues that will destroy asset value over time and undermine societies and economies. It's as simple as that. We're going from extractive capitalism 250 years, which helped a group of people, to hopefully regenerative capitalism. There's no guarantee that will happen. I think we're in the eye of the storm. Final point, ESG has gone through its teenage years, its Klondike phase. We can see structure coming. It's not the acronym. I think Alison is 100% right. That's a red herring.
Okay, thank you. Can we deal with this question? I like to kind of deal with the questions as and when they come in. Johnny Mulligan, what influence or role do you think algorithms and technology play in polarization, which has shrunk the middle ground? Everyone is a slave to online algorithms where our biases are confirmed, which means people can debate opposing sides in the real world, driving polarization and misinformation. So what role do you think algorithms and technology play in the polarization?
I mean, that's certainly a big role. But I think we're in this phase at the moment, right, where we think social media is the root of all evil. John Haidt, who I used to work for, has just published a book called The Anxious Generation, which is about the mental health impact of social media. And he's certainly got a point. But it's important to remember that back in 2010, 2011, we thought social media was going to save democracy. This was thought to have kicked off the Arab Spring and to be giving the public a voice and to be reducing this kind of top-down corruption and lack of accountability of governments. We also saw social media, drive some really interesting transformations, and we saw the leaks from the Panama Papers, the Paradise Papers. We've become much more aware of systemic corruption, much more aware of the way that the global financial system, undermines the rule of law and transparency and so on. So there's been a lot of very powerful impacts that were positive with social media. But what I think has then since become clear to this question is that the business models of these tech firms are designed to drive engagement, which is another way of saying designed to drive outrage. And so there is a lot of evidence, yes, that social media algorithms, we're in this filter bubble, we're seeing the things we want to see, that you do not even, we're not reading the same information, seeing the same facts. And certainly that's escalated polarization, and it's given certain actors, political actors in particular, a very strong impetus to try and manipulate public perception. So, the rise of propaganda is really, really concerning. It's an authoritarian playbook, increasingly playing out in democratic countries as well. So I think it's a huge problem and a huge concern.
Okay, and then Derek asks, how are any of the events since 2021? The fault of public government? I think we need to be transparent on the actors who influence the levers of government. There's little distance between the cloakroom and boardroom, always has been. Just ask Mr. Smith goes to Washington. The distribution should be towards government institutions, but of those who influence it. Well, if you have any comments to make on that, please speak, or else we'll push on with the rest of the show.
Probably Paul should answer this one, but I don't understand the reference to 2021 particularly. But there is a quote in my book from Luigi Zingales, who's a professor at the University of Chicago, and he says what we have is the politicization of the corporate world and the corporatization of the political world. So it's really interesting to think back to Milton Friedman, who envisaged this very sharp line between business and politics. And if that sharp line existed in real life, right, arguably you wouldn't need ESG because governments would be protecting stakeholders and business could focus on profit. But that is not the situation. Arguably, ESG is a response to, that consequence of businesses putting their thumb on the scale to influence public policy, whether it's tax or climate regulation or something else. And so I think it's a good question because we cannot treat ESG in a vacuum. We can't treat it as separate from the questions of how corporations and investors influence government policy. And I think, there's this sort of ironic storyline that you may or may not agree with, which is that corporations spent a lot of time undermining government action with the consequence that now what we used to regard as public policy problems are sitting in corporate laps. All said, and I'll let Paul, I'll let you talk in a minute. Like I get very irritated by people who critique ESG. Tarek Fancy springs to mind, who sort of popped up in 2020 saying what we need is government regulation. That's very easy to say. The reason we've got ESG and sustainability in the first place is a consequence of globalization and businesses going somewhere they can evade regulation. So we've also got all these global collective action problems that just aren't that responsive to national level regulation. Sorry, Paul, go ahead.
No, Michael, thanks, Alison. Look, I want to pick up a couple of the questions and just bridge, right? Which is, if you put it in the macro geopolitical context, we've essentially seen 40 to 50 years of combined deregulation, liberalization, global financialization, right? And there have been benefits in and around that. And I am a card-carrying capitalist. I'm on my 5th startup, despite the UN years. But in that 40 years, you have also seen the role of government, I think, in many contexts, undermined. Then build into that the global financial crash in 2007-8. And let's wire a couple of things together. Go back to 1929. Devastating crash. We didn't see the likes of it until 2007-8, despite a number of crashes. What you then see is the middle class and the working class slowing down and getting hammered. You get the potential for populism to open up. So I think we've seen a convergence of a phenomenal period of global financialization. Finance flows across borders and has done through the 80s, the 90s, 2000s. Deregulation. You then have a crash. You open the door to populism. I think a lot of those big macros crowd in a way that, I love Galbraith. J.K. Galbraith wrote the history of the 1929 crash in the summer of 1953. He was asked, why did you leave it so long to write? And his answer was, it was the shortest possible time. I had to wait a full generation until I really understood the implications of the 29 crash. So complex, complicated, massive political macros, a financial crash, COVID, all of these things mix in together in a way where I think the power of balanced government is undermined. And that's a systemic risk for all of us.
Okay, that comment from Galbraith reminds me of a supposed comment from, I think it was Premier Zhu of China, when he was asked what the consequences of the French Revolution were, and he's supposed to have said it's too soon to tell. So,
can I just jump in there? There was always a confusion around that, and Zhu apparently thought that the questioner was talking about the Paris events of 1968. So, you know,
That's
that'd be a
shame. It just spoils such a good story.
Lost in translation, exactly. Yeah.
Doesn't reality ruin good stories sometimes? But anyway, look, we've had lots of other questions. What I think I'd like to do, if that's okay with you and the people watching this, is press on with a couple of things we were planning to talk about and then come back to those questions in a few minutes. Because Alison, you and I were talking about an article on Bloomberg, I think. ESG poster child Unilever waters down green pledges. Can you just sort of enlighten us a little bit about this?
Yeah, I have found this coverage really interesting and a little bit frustrating. The first thing I think we need to ask up front is why there are so few ESG poster children. It's really Unilever and Patagonia, maybe Warby Parker, but none of my students can ever think of anyone else. So that is one thing to say that I think is really concerning. The second thing to say is that Unilever has made a lot of very ambitious pledges over the years. If you look at its most recent materiality map, not the one before it's reset its goals, you will see about at least 30 issues on it, and you will see very baggy, undefined issues. One of its top right issues is women, for example. They have inequality on there. They have global trade flows. So I think this all reflects the tendency to treat materiality and to treat ESG as sort of everything is material, and to try and tick the box on 40 things and imply that you're solving a lot of big societal challenges you are not necessarily set up to solve. So what Unilever has done more recently is to focus on 4 areas that are a little bit more concrete, a little bit more directly relevant to its business. Those 4 areas are plastics, livelihoods, nature, and climate. It's also made recent moves to align its policy positions with this, and we've been talking a lot about political and corporate overlap. So that's really, really positive. So I would view what Unilever is doing is exactly what needs to happen. More focus, more restraint, more honesty about the problems that you can actually solve and that directly relate to your business model. Unilever has not got a good track record on plastics, and that is, one of its core material issues in terms of impact and in terms of making money. So I think that focus and restraint is long overdue, and it's where all companies need to go. So it is very disappointing to see this press coverage, which is basically, Unilever is a poster child and has cut back on its goals. So that is the kind of thinking, the treating of ESG as basically stealth PR that needs to go away. And so I would draw the opposite conclusion from this reporting, which is that everything will get a lot clearer if we can be more honest about the problems corporations are really going to take on, if we acknowledge that no corporation, even of Unilever's size, is able to focus on 30 or 40 things. And if we're going to get serious, we need to get serious about material issues to that business in question. There is too much kind of telegraphing and yodeling about important but side issues at the expense of the challenges relating to whatever company's it is core business model.
Okay, thank you. And then, Paul, you spotted a piece in the Financial Times. In fact, I think you shared it on LinkedIn. Shell sold millions of phantom carbon credits. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, look, rather than speak to that article, I'll speak to the bigger issue for Shell and the broader oil and gas and fossil fuel industry. For a long time, I'm very much a market pragmatist, and I felt that big energy, big oil and gas had to be part of the solution in terms of sustainability. They have the balance sheets, they have the knowledge in terms of how to deliver energy. I think over the last few years, where we've seen windfall profits, we've seen some absolutely fundamental strategic errors from companies like Shell. And I think what they've opened themselves up for is the sort of growing tsunami of climate-related litigation they've made bad strategic decisions. They've tried to position themselves not as part of the solution, but holding tight to legacy fossil fuel. Now, I don't think we're suddenly going to see fossil fuel, whether that's in China, India, Indonesia, Brazil. It's not going to disappear as quickly as some people would hope. But what we need to see from big energy, from the Seven Sisters, from Shell, from Exxon, from Total, the big players with the balance sheets, we have to see absolutely fundamental forward visioning where they become part of the solution. I'm afraid that my long-held view that they had to be part of the solution has really diluted. I don't trust them anymore. I don't trust the boards of the big companies. I think 95% of the companies are locked into thinking, how do we continue to enrich the C-suite and make lots of money? I think maybe 5% are looking ahead. So my fundamental view on the fossil fuel industry in terms of its leadership, more than anything else, is they've made fundamental strategic errors. I think we're at the very beginning of climate litigation. What's the signal for that? You're seeing third-party funders pour in to climate-related litigation. We were tracking 1,100 pieces of litigation a few years back. It's gone through the roof. Now, not all of that is serious, but I think it's a real signal to the market. So in terms of Shell, in terms of the complexity of carbon markets, if we project ahead, I think we're seeing a shift in the markets. It will go from the voluntary markets to sovereign over the next 10 years. I think there's room for both markets, voluntary carbon markets, but more importantly, the Article 6.2 in the UNFCCC, Article 6 out of Paris. I think we're seeing a real shift to mega scale sovereign to sovereign, and the market is already beginning to happen there. So for the oil companies, the game is changing, and they need to change and position far more strategically than they have. So I think that that piece in the FT is simply, it's a canary in the coal mine, if you'll forgive the pun. And there needs to be a complete renewal at the top of the fossil fuel industry. They need to position as part of the solution, not the ongoing problem.
Okay, thanks for that. So Salvador thinks that Shell are showing off, at least I believe, if I've understood his comment correctly. So we've got lots of really interesting questions, and I just wanted to say to people who've asked those questions, Derek, Johnny, Santinder, Beth, and Anna, we will be turning to your questions shortly. They're not going to be ignored. But I wanted to sort of move the discussion on a little bit. It seems to me that the criticism of ESG falls into two camps. There are those who worry about greenwashing, the kind of things that we just touched upon with the Shell story and so on. And there are those who they see ESG as a kind of a smokescreen to cover up companies' own failings. And then there are those who just don't like ESG. They just think the concept is fundamentally flawed. Is that a fair characterization, do you think, or have I oversimplified it? It's a question for either of you.
Go for it, Paul.
Look, I think it's a fair enough characterization. And let me offer a sort of view around this. Capitalism is very good, and I have no problem with it, of co-opting good things. So we know that capitalism co-opted Che Guevara's image for T-shirts, that it co-opted the sort of cool surfing culture to sell lots of product. And I think in part ESG has been co-opted, and it's created a $53 billion industry of ESG service providers, data suppliers, consultancies, right? But I think, and again, it comes back to the point, it doesn't really matter the acronym. What needs to be influenced in terms of ESG is really very simple, right? There's three questions in capitalism and for capital markets. Is it a material risk to your business or your investment? Yes or no? If it's no, move on. And it's about the risk prioritization. If it is a risk, how do you deal with that? If you don't deal with it, what does that mean for your fiduciary duty? So again, it's pressing home the point that ESG is about materiality, whether it's double materiality or dynamic materiality, perhaps that's for another day, but it's for a business or an investor or even a capital market, a whole board to decide where are the real material risks? So it's about simplification, prioritization. You don't do the entire drop-down menu on ESG. If you're a company in a given sector, you should know your priority risks. And I think in the context, again, of ESG, it is about the ability for governance of a board to prioritize in and around those risks and deal with them effectively over a period of time. So it's not ethics. In terms of Tucker Carlson, it is not an ideology. It's simply about how fiduciary law does shift over time as policy changes. We have lots of examples. I'll stop here, whether it's asbestos or cigarettes, all of those types of things. Fiduciary law shifts over time. It is not stationary. It is not cast in ice. And ESG is a helper to understand how your materiality prioritization and your fiduciary duties, whether you are publicly or privately held, come together in a planet which is changing and where risk is morphing and converging because of all the factors that we know.
Okay, thanks for that. Incidentally, you mentioned double materiality. We've got a show on double materiality in about a month's time. So Tucker Carlson, for example, blamed an economic crash in Sri Lanka on ESG. I think he blames an awful lot of other things on ESG as well. Presumably, I assume you think he's mistaken there.
Alison, do you want to have a bat at that one?
I don't know what the argument is about ESG and Sri Lanka specifically, Michael. Can you walk me through that?
I will. I don't have
Michael,
the article.
Michael, I could jump in very quickly. Look, I think, sure, Tucker Carlson, in the context of Sri Lanka, that's throwing up a straw man. I think in terms of the implosion of the political system in Sri Lanka over an extended period of time was far more fundamental to that. And you could say that in terms of governance writ large, including political governance, that the precipitous decline in the Sri Lankan economy was much more dependent upon a failure of a working political system. And that began to affect all the institutions, including the judiciary. You could roll it back to, in some ways, going way back to the Civil War and, what happened after the Jaffna Peninsula. But in terms of politics and the slide into de facto autocracy was far more present in the economic decline of Sri Lanka. And we can all hope that the country recovers and rebuilds in the way that it should. It's not ESG. That's, to be honest, Tucker Carlson is flagging a prime time moment to play to the sort of politicization of ESG. I mean, it speaks to the
One of the things I find really funny is that no matter who you are, you've got a problem with ESG. So on the right, it's portrayed as this kind of stealth socialism. This is a really bad faith argument because everybody on the right wants the campaign finance to keep flowing and doesn't want to do anything about Citizens United and doesn't really want business out of politics. They just want business to stop talking about politics. I also find it quite funny that on the left, or the pro-sustainability camp, critique ESG for not going nearly far enough. And there has also been this move, I think, on the left to try and push corporations into taking positions to influence the political sphere. And so, if you can get a corporation to make a lot of noise about reproductive rights or gun control or something like that, that is perceived to help the Democrats politically. And so it's this sort of fascinating thing where everybody is sort of projecting all this stuff on ESG that it was never designed to carry in the first place. Paul has described the origins. He's described what it is supposed to achieve. And I think, it's amusing or not, depending on how you see this. The consequence is that we're so polarized that it has now become a kind of convenient bogeyman to blame whatever you want, to say. It was kind of something very similar, but with DEI, where everyone, all these people were very keen to blame Boeing, Boeing's problems on DEI. So, it has nothing to do with DEI. This is about health and safety and the maximisation of profits over health and safety. But because the company had a DEI initiative, you can then say, well, here's some money, so let's just use this as an excuse to attack DEI. So there's all this noise and all this misinformation. It's coming from both sides. But I think it's interesting to hear Paul talk about what it actually is and isn't.
Michael, can I to build on, just very briefly to build on what Alison said, but in terms of also connects corporate lobbying. Look, 1998, 1999, 2000, I worked not in, but very, very closely with a foot in the deep oil lobby in and around climate change, right? And I saw it in full power working inside the UNFCCC, and I wasn't an observer, I was in the rooms with them, okay? Now, what's my point there? One of the things about ESG is that the lobbyists simply didn't see it coming. The lobbyists did not see ESG coming until 2018. And very highly paid corporate lobbyists missed it. It was planted as a virus in the investment chain. It bubbled away with the asset owners, and then it popped out. That's my contention, right? So when you'll all recall the gentleman we had, 18 months ago, where there was a hidden camera and he was describing Exxon's lobbying processes. It was quite a high profile video. He was being very specific. He'd been offered another job and he was explaining what he'd been doing. Those lobbyists on H Street in Washington or in Brussels simply didn't see ESG coming, and that it was around materiality, fiduciary duty, and it was in the investment chain, and large asset owners are asking questions. I think there's certainly a book in that. But anyway, Michael, back to you.
Okay. Incidentally, I did found a quote from Tucker Carlson. The underlying reason for the fall in Sri Lanka is that its leaders fell under the spell of Western green elites peddling organic agriculture and ESG, is what he said. But anyway,
I mean, that's not even. It's not worth a reply. It's just nonsense.
It's the same thing as like the Democrats want to take away your beef burgers. It's just not interesting.
Okay, so you don't think the Democrats want to take away our beef burgers then, Alison? That's a controversial opinion. That's a joke. I have no opinion about that whatsoever. Paul, BlackRock has talked about putting less emphasis on the S in ESG, putting more on the E and the G bit. Have you any thoughts about that?
Yeah, look, in the political environment that BlackRock operates in, I can understand absolutely. You're an asset manager of that size, with that weight, with that exposure in the market, and playing politics in a way that an asset manager would have to. It's sort of understandable. It sort of goes back to the roots of ESG in terms of a lot of fog, a lot of data and indexes, and you have to do everything. The ESG component, it's not E and S and G. It was ESG, and the fundamental plan was to shift culture, to shift thinking, that there is an interconnectivity of environmental issues and social issues. Governance is the most important thing. So it's about, if you think ESG, it begins to just nudge culture along. If a board is thinking ESG, and most boards do not have the prerequisite experience to deal with these things, a lot of stuff ends up on the desk of the general counsel now in large corporations, and they cannot deal with it. I mean, I work very, very closely with the GCs of some of the largest multinationals, and the ESG nightmare for them and the regulatory tsunami is a true nightmare. So ESG ultimately is to change the way companies think in the context of, is it a risk? Isn't it a risk? How does it affect our value? How does it affect our long-term value in the market? How do we deal with it? So again, coming back to the question, if you go back to fundamentals, it wasn't meant to change the world. It was just meant to tinker with how asset managers think about their investments and their plays. But it's taken on a life of its own. Michael, I hope that helps.
No, it does indeed. Thank you for that. I think what I'd like to do is turn to some of the questions. We've been getting rather a lot of questions and indeed observations from the audience. So let's turn to some of them. So Beth asked the question, what role can the UNFCCC and the COP process play in galvanizing finance for areas that have up to now fallen out of investors' focus? Any thoughts about that?
Could I come on that? Yeah, could I come on? Look, I was yesterday in Baku. I was with the Azeri government senior finance lead for the presidency. So as you know, Baku's convening COP29 in November. It's what's part of the Troika, which was the 28 COP UAE, Azerbaijan next year, and then COP30 in Belém, Brazil next year. It's known as the Troika. So to answer that question specifically, I think, and maybe getting a little bit too focused and nerdy, the Article 6 of Paris, when it was agreed at Glasgow in 21, opens up the ability for sovereign to sovereign carbon trades. If it's done effectively, if it's finalized, what you'll see is a massive increase in the credibility of trades. And if we get it right, you will see that financial flow into the 46 least developed countries, the rainforest countries, the SIDS, the small island developing states, or as they sometimes like to be called now, the large ocean states, which I think is a better approach. So haven't got time here to get into the detail, but one of the key discussions in Baku was in and around, Dubai did some good things, but it let the least developed countries and the middle income countries really down in terms of the ability to trigger significant financial flows. That in part has to be fixed in Azerbaijan, which is becoming known as the finance COP, and then delivered at scale in Brazil. So I think it's a great question. And look, the G7, the G20, we have failed to deliver on climate finance in terms of that commitment way back in 2015. The only way that can be fixed is, I think, a shift from voluntary markets to sovereign Article 6 markets.
Okay, thank you for that. And Anna, do you see the IRA being able to drive ESG factor considerations into investments? Any thoughts about that? Don't worry if you haven't.
I think, look, in terms of the Inflation Reduction Act, I think history will view it, whatever the politics is in the US, very favorably. I think in terms of the IRA driving, I think it's already happening. I don't think it's able. I think it has been a fundamental trigger in terms of the greening of energy and the energy production in the US, to the extent that it's frozen out flows of investment into other countries in terms of their renewable energy industries. So in terms of is it a factor? I think IRA is a huge factor in terms of triggering a rethink in some of the key US states. We shouldn't always think federal. We should also think about the states and their individual roles. But Alison, I'm sure you've got a view on the IRA.
Yeah, I mean, what I've heard is that it is exactly as you say, galvanizing enormous investment shifts and making the US more competitive in a lot of areas than the EU, which is really interesting. So it's also a case study in investor or regulation design and where we should be focusing there.
Okay, thank you for that. Now we had a comment here which I thought was quite interesting. ESG doesn't support materiality, doesn't to protect social materiality, but investor materiality, which I think touches on what you're saying. I think it was you, Alison, earlier. That some people.
This is the debate in the sustainability community, and it's often expressed as double versus single materiality. So, in a way, this just kind of highlights how weird it is that this has become politicized, because the whole premise of ESG is that you select the environmental and social and governance issues that directly relate to your financial returns and risk management and fiduciary duty. You do not select them on the basis of some other ideological or social goal. So this kind of brings us back to what I was saying a minute ago, which is that if you're on the sustainability end of the spectrum, you likely think that ESG doesn't go far enough, whereas if you're on the other side, you think it goes much too far. But that debate is playing out and increasingly becoming a source of tension between the US and Europe, because Europe is more focused on the impact of business on society.
I think to add to that very briefly, look, I think ESG does get clobbered for lots of things which actually structurally way beyond it, which is the ongoing problem of the privatization of profit and the socialization of risk. If you look at the global financial crash, et cetera, that, and also the whole subsidies piece, which we don't want to get into, but subsidies of industries enable and empower the downplaying, I think, of social materiality in a way which is exceptional. But that's a different discussion. Back to you, Michael.
Okay, thank you. So we've had a number of comments, and I'm just showing the comments if they haven't asked a question, but I think there is a question lurking in this one. Johnny Mulligan, Paul Clements Hunt, nearly 10 years after the Paris 1.5 degree agreement, scientists has said we are past 2.5 degrees. Have regulators and governments introduced sufficient legislation to make boards and investors, starting with big oil and gas, take action?
It really is the $1 million question. I think history in 2060 will actually look back on the UNFCCC process and COP favorably, because what you're trying to do is shift an economic model, give or take, of 250 years in a few decades. I think that the degree to which the UNFCCC process has been undermined by external influences is totally misunderstood. It's been far more impacted. So I think in some ways UNFCCC, for all its criticisms and fault, is on the edge of creating a new market. In terms of Johnny's question, at 1.5, it's clear that where we are racing to way past 2.5, and the scientists are right. On the regulatory question, it's that issue of politicians judging just how much a population can take. I think the EU is pushing it quite hard. I think other countries perhaps could do better. It's incredibly complex. We are trying to shift an entire operating system for over 200 years into something new really quickly. Could we have been better? Yes. Is the complexity huge? Yes. I think the governments need to actually back with action what they're committing to, and the most of them aren't. That's one of the key issues within the process. And our 5-year political cycle within the Western democracies does not help or aid that at all.
Okay, thank you. So, Derek, how do we address corporate impacts on society that are not aligned with short-term financial materiality? This is the critical critique of ESG and of Unilever. I wish more corporates would be as frank as Unilever, which is, we are only addressing issues that are material for short-term interest of the shareholders. When that overlaps with social benefits and improves social outcomes, great. When not, tough luck. Not my problem unless someone makes it our problem. I don't know if you have any comments to make on that, but I thought it was interesting.
I mean, this is the question. Do we rely on regulation? Do we rely on shifts in social norms? There isn't some magical answer that no one's thought about here. Some people will say go the direction the EU is going and regulate impact. Other people will say that's a disastrous idea with disastrous second-order consequences. We can also bring in, this is a somewhat inconvenient argument for us in the West, that China, for example, is able through government policy to put down top-down requirements and get things done. So I kind of take the point that this is a problem. I'm not sure what to say to people wanting a magical answer here, but I would agree with his comment that it's better if corporations say, here's what we're doing and here's what we're not doing, so we can actually see the problem, rather than what they have been doing for the last decade, which is suggesting, implying, commenting, putting PR out there, suggesting they're going to solve problems they're in fact not going to solve, which is really the worst of all worlds, because then we have have expectations on corporations they're not designed to fulfill and lead to scapegoating, and we can't have a sensible discussion about what we actually need instead. Yes, you can say, Derek, hence the need for government regulations, but there are limits to what government regulations can achieve in a polarized environment, and because what we need is global solutions. So national regulations often move the problem around. This is the entire point of ESG in the first place, was that companies were going to countries to do things to access raw materials and cheap labor and evade their national level regulations. So we need to stop going round and round in circles and saying the solution is regulation.
And yeah, just very briefly, Michael, if I may, I realize we're at the top of the hour. Look, Galbraith, Pigou, a range of economists had actually graphed and understood most externalities back in the late 20s, even earlier in the 30s. We ignored it for close to 100 years as a global society in many ways. You know, it's not as if we didn't understand the problems of social externalities, environmental externalities. We really have let 100 years slip by, and that's why we're racing now. There's no immediate regulatory fix. It's about a change in culture. It's about a change in systems, and that's immensely hard to do. But look, ESG was a very small contribution to that, which was to say to the largest investors, these systemic risks are real, that in the mid to long term, the values of the UN and your values are aligned, because no one will make money if the world goes to hell in a handbasket. It's sort of as simple as that. No, there's no short regulatory fix, but it is about societal shift. And Alison, I'm sure you agree, it's really difficult. I think your work in terms of practical action that companies can take is absolutely fundamental. But in terms of the systemic shift, we've got decades of work to do, and we're playing catch up.
Okay, to be honest with you, we're getting too many questions. I can't cope with all these questions that are coming in, and we're approaching the so maybe I could ask you, if you possibly can, to give us a super quick answer. How do we facilitate more conversation about the role of corporations in our society, and how does that move us towards corporate government structures that better align corporate and societal goals? Blimey, that's not an easy question.
Talk about it. I am constantly bewildered by the way that academia in particular, but really feels like 90% of the debate is, does ESG drive alpha, and a load of academics arguing about the various evidence. And we are not saying what is the role we want business to have in society. We're not getting to the point. We are not having these conversations, and we need to start. And I feel like the debate over ESG and does or doesn't it work is just a kind of, again, a red herring, which is that we need to have a normative conversation about what we are really going to do about this giant poly crisis that we're in, and kind of stop moving the blame around.
Okay. I think that we probably are out of time. I'm just going to ask you, do you have anything else to add before we close? Any sort of sum up points that you want to make, or do you feel that you've said what you want to say? Alison.
I feel like I've said what I want to say, but let me just say it for the third time. The debate over ESG and whether we need a new term or a new idea, or whether we're pro or anti, is all noise. What we need to do as a society is talk about the role of corporations, talk about what we're expecting them to do, talk about what they are realistically going to do under their own steam, and then talk about how to close the gap where they are not going to close it. I mean, it's not that complicated, but we are managing to make it very complicated.
All right, thank you. And Paul, anything to add before we end?
Violent agreement with Alison, which is always a nightmare on a podcast or whatever this is, but violent agreement. And in terms of my message, again, ESG is actually simple. There's a simple question that sits at the heart of capitalism. And whether you're a business or investor, there's 3 decks. Is this a material risk to my business or investment? Yes or no? If it's no, move on. If it's yes, what are you doing about it to mitigate, transfer, manage, or reduce that risk? If you decide not to do it, what does that mean for your fiduciary duty, right? And it's not about ethics. It's not about social responsibility. It's about the very heart of business that actually fiduciary law naturally shifts over time as public policy shifts. So that brings you back to good governance, good governance, and the ability for regulators and institutions to actually follow up. In a deliberalized economy for 40 years, we've seen many of those institutions chipped away. The Environment Agency in the UK, that's a great example. If you look at what's happened back in the early 90s, UK water was pretty good. At the moment, we're being litigated against the French because of our ability to pour our fresh sewage into the English Channel, right? That's what happens when liberalization goes wrong and institutions are undermined. I'll stop there. But Alison, I really enjoyed your input. I'm going to buy your book. I'm ashamed that I haven't read it. And Michael, I'm going to plug for a book. I'm going to plug a book which I haven't even written yet, but it'll be called The Beast, the Blue Zoo. The Beast is finance, the Blue Zoo is the UN, and it will be a tell-all tale. Alison, I'll send you a draft to approve.
Love it.
Okay?
Can't wait. Hit me up for an endorsement when you're ready.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Paul and Alison, and thank you everybody for watching this. See you next week when we're looking at the intersection of cyber.
Michael, many thanks to you. Thanks to you.
Yeah,
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.